Okay, Chapter 18, the autonomic nervous system, ANS. It regulates the activity of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and certain glands. It includes the autonomic sensory neurons, integrating centers in the CNS, central nervous system, the autonomic motor neurons, the enteric division located in the wall of the gastrointestinal system. The autonomic nervous system is regulated by centers in the brain, primarily the hypothalamus and the brainstem. In the somatic nervous system, the sensory neurons transmit information from the receptors for the special senses and somatic senses. These sensations are normally consciously perceived. Somatic motor neurons innervate skeletal muscle to cause excitation, so this could be contraction, and therefore they produce voluntary movement. Each somatic motor pathway consists of a single somatic motor neuron that extends from the central nervous system to the skeletal system. So the somatic motor neuron releases acetylcholine. In the autonomic nervous system, the autonomic visceral sensory neurons transmit information from the interoceptors, such as chemoreceptors, and the sensations are usually not consciously perceived. In the autonomic motor neurons, they innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands to produce activities that are usually not under conscious control. And they cause excitation or inhibition of effector tissue activity. So the autonomic motor pathway consists of sets of two motor neurons in series. The first has its cell body in the central nervous system, and its myelinated axon extends from the central to an autonomic ganglion. And the second neuron has its cell body in the autonomic ganglion, and its unmyelinated axon extends directly to the autonomic effector. Autonomic motor neurons release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. The output motor part of the ANS has two divisions. You have the sympathetic, which is often called the fight or flight, and then you have the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest division. Okay, the anatomy of the autonomic motor pathways. Anatomical components. The preganglionic neuron is the first of the two autonomic motor neurons. Its cell body is in the brain or the spinal cord. Its myelinated axon exits the central nervous system as part of a cranial or spinal nerve, and it separates from the nerve and extends to an autonomic ganglion where it synapses with a postganglionic neuron. And the postganglionic neuron is the second of the two autonomic motor neurons, and it's located entirely outside the central nervous system. Its cell body and dendrites are located in the autonomic ganglia where it synapses with one or more preganglionic fibers, and its unmyelinated axon extends to a visceral effector. So the preganglionic neurons have their cell bodies in the lateral gray horns of the 12 thoracic segments and the first two lumbar segments of the spinal cord. So the sympathetic division is also called the thoracolumnar division, and the axons of the sympathetic preganglionic neurons are known as the thoracolumbar outflow. Okay, so in the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic neurons have their cell bodies located in the brainstem nuclei of the four cranial nerves and in the lateral gray horns of the second through the fourth sacral segments of the spinal cord. Therefore, the parasympathetic division is called the craniosacral division, and the axons of the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are known as the craniosacral outflow. The autonomic ganglia. The sympathetic ganglia include the sympathetic trunk ganglia, that are a series of ganglia that lie in a vertical row on either side of the vertebral column, extending from the base of the skull to the coccyx. They are called the vertebral chain ganglia or the paravertebral ganglia. So due to the close proximity of these to the spinal cord, most sympathetic preganglionic fibers are relatively short. Postganglionic fibers of the paravertebral ganglia in general innervate organs above the diaphragm. Examples include the superior, middle, and inferior cervical ganglia. The prevertebral or collateral ganglia that are located anterior to the spine and close to the large abdomen arteries. The postganglionic fibers of these prevertebral ganglia in general innervate organs below the diaphragm. So this includes like the celiac ganglion, superior and inferior mesenteric ganglia. The parasympathetic preganglionic fibers extend to the terminal ganglia, which are located very close or within the wall of the visceral organ. So the parasympathetic preganglionic fibers tend to be relatively long. Examples include the ciliary ganglion and the otic ganglion, OTIC. The postganglionic neurons, the terminal branches of the post-autonomic fibers, contain numerous swellings called villosities that simultaneously release a neurotransmitter over a large area of the innervated organ. Axons of the sympathetic preganglionic neurons extend to the sympathetic trunk ganglia, both paravertebral and prevertebral. Axons of the parasympathetic preganglionic neurons extend to a terminal ganglia where they synapse with 4 or 5 postganglionic neurons, all of which innervate a single visceral effector. Therefore, the parasympathetic effects tend to be localized. The autonomic nervous system neurotransmitters and receptors. So based on the neurotransmitter they release, the autonomic neurons are classified as either cholinergic or adrenergic, and the neurotransmitter receptors are integral membrane proteins in the plasma membrane of the postsynaptic neuron or the effector cell. So the cholinergic neurons and receptors, the cholinergic neurons release the acetylcholine, and they include all sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic neurons, the sympathetic postganglionic neurons that innervate most sweat glands, and all parasympathetic postganglionic neurons. So the acetylcholine binds to the cholinergic receptors on the postsynaptic plasma membrane to cause excitation or inhibition. There are 2 types of these receptors. There is the nicotinic and the muscarinic. The nicotinic versus the muscarinic receptors. The nicotinic become ion channels for sodium. The muscarinic phosphorylate various secondary messengers. ACH is quickly inactivated, or acetylcholine is quickly inactivated by acetylcholinesterase, ACHE. Therefore, ACH effects on the postsynaptic cells are brief. Adrenergic neurons release norepinephrine and noradrenaline. Most sympathetic postganglionic neurons are adrenergic and secrete norepinephrine, whose effect on the postsynaptic receptor cells is to cause excitation or inhibition. So adrenergic receptors bind both norepinephrine and epinephrine. There are 2 main types of adrenergic receptors. You have the alpha receptors and the beta receptors. Both function as excitatory or inhibitory. Okay, the methyltransferase, COMT, or monoamine oxidase, MAO, since any lingers in the synaptic cleft longer than the ACH, the effects triggered by the adrenergic neurons are longer lasting than those triggered by the cholinergic neurons. Functions of the ANS. Most autonomic effectors have dual innervation. The 2 divisions generally have opposing effects, with one division causing excitation, the other causing inhibition. The hypothalamus regulates the balance of the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic activity. The 2 divisions have opposing effects because their postganglionic neurons release different neurotransmitters, and the effectors have different neurotransmitter receptors. Some autonomic effectors receive only sympathetic innervation, and these include the sweat glands, the erector pili, muscles, the kidneys, the spleen, most blood vessels, and the adrenal medulla. The sympathetic and the parasympathetic responses. The sympathetic division is dominant over the parasympathetic during times of physical or emotional stress. High sympathetic activity favors body functions that can support vigorous physical activity and rapid ATP productions. It elicits, along with adrenal medullary hormones, a series of physiological responses collectively called the fight or flight response. These effects are longer lasting and more widespread than the effects of the parasympathetic stimulation. So this fight or flight, if you're in an emergency situation, that's what you're going to do. You're going to fight or flight. I have found out for my own, I'm more of a flight person. The parasympathetic division. This is the part that enhances the rest and digest activities that support body functions. They conserve and restore body energy during times of rest or recovery. It's normally dominant over the sympathetic and affecting the organs of the digestive system. It elicits the SLUD, S-L-U-D-D, responses. This is salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion, and defecation. It also decreases heart rate, it decreases the bronchial diameter, and it decreases the pupil diameter. So the integration and the control of the autonomic functions, the autonomic reflexes adjust the activities of the visceral effectors like the heart, the blood vessels, and the bronchioles, the GI tract, etc. And they therefore play a key role in activities involved in homeostasis. So an autonomic reflex arc has 5 components. You have number 1, a receptor, number 2, the sensory neuron, number 3, the integrating center in the central nervous system, number 4, the motor neurons, whether they be the preganglionic or the postganglionic neuron, and number 5, the effector, the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle, or the gland. The autonomic controls by the higher centers. So the hypothalamus is the major control and integrated center in the autonomic nervous system. It receives sensory input related to the visceral functions, olfaction, gustation, body temperature, osmolarity, and levels of various substances in the blood. It also receives input relating to emotions from the limbic system. Output from the hypothalamus influences the autonomic centers. So axons from this hypothalamic nuclei form tracts that lead to the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nuclei in the brainstem and the spinal cord through relays in the reticular formation. The posterior and the lateral portions of the hypothalamus control the sympathetic division, and the anterior and the medial portions of the hypothalamus control the parasympathetic division.